past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Well, greetings and welcome back. As always, thank you all so much for joining me. Newsday reports U.S. sends nuclear submarine and 4,000 troops into the Caribbean. And the U.S. is deploying more than 4,000 Marines and sailors to waters in the Caribbean as part of an exercise, as they say, to combat drug cartels. Is this the reason or the ruse, the maneuver, the feint, the indirect means to gain an advantage? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. Kilmar Abrego Garcia has again been detained by ICE days after his release from custody. He was detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement earlier today after arriving at the agency's Baltimore field offices as part of a required check-in after his release pending trial on human smuggling charges. The detention comes 3 days after the undocumented immigrant was freed by a federal judge who determined he did not pose a flight risk or danger to the community. Trump officials have insisted that he would never go free in the United States, and ICE notified him shortly after his release on Friday that they would deport him to Uganda within days. As Gil Scott-Heron once said, some call it due process, but too many are overdue. FEMA staff warns Trump officials' actions risk a Katrina-level disaster. About 180 FEMA employees, many of them anonymous, signed a letter to Congress arguing that agency leadership has hindered the ability to effectively manage emergencies. Just ask the folks recently in Texas. This is where the difference between being elected and being able to govern come into play. There is a huge difference between the two. And finally, Trump badly wants a Nobel Peace Prize. This is from the Washington Post. Most of the committee, the Nobel Committee, is in opposition to him. At least 3 of the 5 members of the Norwegian Prize Committee have criticized Trump policy, making his path to winning their votes far from clear. President Trump has long quested after a Nobel Prize, a distinction that would put him in a vaunted and exclusive club, especially as it relates to American presidents. But unlike a U.S. presidential campaign, winning a Nobel Prize depends on an electorate of 5, and Trump may not have the majority. Pay very, very close attention to this, because I think his getting it or not getting it could indicate a couple of things. One, if he does wind up getting a Peace Prize, one will have to scratch their heads and ask, How in the world did that happen, and who got paid in order to make it happen? And also, I think a big part of his desire to get a Nobel Prize is because the Nobel Committee awarded President Barack Obama one well before they should have. And I believe they set themselves up for this kind of problem by awarding a prize to an undeserving American president. That now has Donald Trump scratching his head saying, well, if you gave it to him, why not me? With that being said, on today's episode, the issue before us is Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti, America's team condemns U.S. I'm sorry, let me do that again. The Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti, America team has condemns the U.S. government attack on Venezuelan sovereignty. There we go. The United States has issued a $50 million bounty while sanctioning Venezuelan people and starving Gaza. My guest is a writer and organizer in Baltimore and the DMV, the District, Maryland, and Virginia areas. She is the Field Operations and Membership Coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, a member of the Black Working Class Centered Ujamaa People's Progress Party in Maryland, and founder of hashtag Liberation Through Reading, providing American children with books that represent them. Erica Caines, as always, Erica, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. I always say like my bio seems to get longer and longer, but it has done some adjusting. I am currently national co-coordinator alongside Austin Cole and Tunde Sazua of Black Alliance for Peace.
Great. Thank you very much for that update. And I will be sure that going forward, we keep that straight. The Trump State Department, and this is from the Black Alliance for Peace statement, the Trump State Department and the Department of Justice have once again increased hostility against the elected president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, doubling its reward up to $50 million for information leading to the arrest and or conviction of the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The press release states, quote, for over a decade, Maduro has been a leader of Cartel de los Soles, which is responsible for trafficking drugs into the United States. Erica Caines, there seems to now be no end to what the United States will try to do to play policeman for the world. Erica Caines.
Yeah, well, you know, the U.S. has imposed sanctions in response to activities by the Venezuelan government, and its Venezuelan individuals for quite some time. And we know that tens of thousands of Venezuelans, as a result to continuous sanctions, have reportedly died. And because of these U.S. bipartisan relations and sort of relentless assault on their economy. But I do think there is a conversation to be had about the way that the U.S. in total, when I name that it's a bipartisan effort, it has been the U.S. in totality that has always been this aggressive towards Venezuela. We've seen during the Trump administration, during the first one, of course, that was a very extremely cruel response to Venezuelan sovereignty. But then comes the Biden administration that continued to recognize Juan Guaido as legitimate, the illegal arrest and persecution of Alex Saab. We have the blocking Venezuela alongside Cuba and Nicaragua from the Summit of the Americas, and then the Bolivarian Act that occurred during the first year of the Trump administration, the Bolivar Act, to stop the support and financial exchange to Venezuela, all under the guise of continuing to say that there is some kind of narco-esque thing happening with Venezuela. But we understand this at Black Alliance for Peace as what we discuss as full spectrum dominance, that this has been a bipartisan imperialist doctrine, continuing to maintain U.S. economic, political, and military superiority and hegemony in every single aspect. We had the Biden administration saying, the Americas is no longer the backyard, but the front yard, kind of signaling that this is some kind of exchange or difference in relationship. But it's always been imperialist aggression against Venezuela to maintain control of the Americas, right? And now we see Trump is back. And so we have this sort of mask off, overtly aggressive policies and statements being made, including this up to $50 million reward or bounty on Maduro's head, which is, again, something that is or has been consistent in terms of the way the U.S. deals with or relates to the Venezuelan government. So this is coming from a country, again, that we name in our statement, that has facilitated Israel in carrying and live stream genocide, right? We have continued to see this for over 23 months at this point. We are embarking on it on 2 years in October. So this points to the U.S. hypocrisy and the way that the U.S. is attacking certain nations while appeasing others or being welcome into others because of U.S. specific interests in maintaining or expanding its hegemony globally, whether here in the Americas or we see what's happening in West Asia or in the Middle East, rather.
To your point, it seems as though the ire of America is out to be kind, I'll say selective. Because if this has to do with narco trafficking, I could be off here, but something I seem to recall, there's a country called Colombia that has a history of narco trafficking. Peru, I believe, is another country. And I haven't heard the Trump administration directing its ire towards either of those countries. In fact, I think Colombia is one of the countries that the United States uses as a training ground, as it wants to train military, Central and South American military governments on how to oppress people. Similar to what they were doing, what was it called? The College of Americas?
School of the Americas.
School of the Americas. Thank you. School of the Americas. So Colombia has played that role, I believe, for the United States as well. So not that it would be one thing if the United States interest and ire were equally applied across the board, but the selectivity of it makes it even more suspect.
Yeah, well, one, even to the point of Colombia, right? That's Plan Colombia. And I do want to raise that has historically been the relationship between Colombia, the U.S., and even Israel. Israel has trained Colombian militants and such. But there is with the new governance that is particularly favorable to left politics, however you want to call it. I do think that you are seeing those struggles occur in ways that I do believe that the eye on Colombia is really more so about the leadership moving it in a different direction, right?
Sure, okay.
Colombia away from being known as that narco the country for that, right? So I do think that there is tension there with the leadership, especially as it is progressive, especially as we see Petro making more comments about Israel and standing against that. So that creates a different particular kind of tension that with Colombia. And then it also raises more questions about CELAC and CELAC's response to, and as you can see, the CELAC response to this overt aggression against Maduro and then Venezuela has been in support of the Venezuela government and the reestablishment of the zone of peace and language around that, of sovereignty, defending and protecting and acknowledging the sovereignty and that these countries have the right to wage its way forward. But I do want to name, at the time where we released that statement, we had also released a statement around DC. and what was happening in DC. And you could see here the attacks on Maduro, and then the idea of what is being said, or the narrative around this country, similar to the narrative around Colombia, and then we can say Honduras and everywhere, Central America, which also, I think if we want to track it, we can say that this is coming out of the Reagan administration, etc. But I do see that there are ties there in terms of how we're speaking about DC as well. Like, what are the foundations that have been laid or set that has we now see I don't want to say normalization, but the reaction to the spectacle of the National Guard, without consideration that we've seen this before during Plan Colombia, when they raise that DC is a crack haven, etc., that it needs to be occupied, right? So we see the ways that the U.S. in tandem uses these sort of global and domestic policies bipartisanly, right? It's not a difference. And so the reason to name, like, this is something that the Trump administration is doing, yes, but this is something that the Trump administration is doing in continuance of the way that they even relate or respond to Venezuela. And it is in response to wanting to break up the sort of triple threat that exists of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which was previously Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada, right? Understanding that there are these 3 points of anti-imperialism, 3 points of moving into a socialist direction that moves it's a little darker than the pink tide, right? It's not so much democratic socialism.
Explain why it's darker than the pink tide.
Well, I do think they have a bit more concrete politic in that sense. I think when we think about the pink tide, we're thinking about democratic socialism, right? And that has its own set of criticisms. But when we look at Peru or Brazil, I think there's a way that we can look at the way that they kind of give into the right to their own detriment. Like, that leads into these sort of practices of lawfare that has happened to we've seen in Brazil, and is currently what Peru is. So there's a difference, I think, in the way that things are governed under democratic socialism. But that's, we can have that argument, but I don't think that's the reason that Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are being attacked, right? The entire Americas is under assault, right? And I think it is under assault because there's the ways that the U.S. wants to maintain its ownership of the Americas, right? It is no small thing for Biden to say, oh, it's no longer our backyard, right? It is our front yard, because it is a way that they have tried to maintain that in pseudo diplomatic ways, right? Meanwhile, the core group exists. Meanwhile, there's these alliances that exist for security reasons across the Caribbean that is solely tied to the U.S. and Southcom and etc. Right? So these are ways that the U.S. is trying to maintain its hegemony in the region. So calling out Maduro is a way to chip away at that, as they are also chipping away at policy-wise at Cuba. Right, tightening up the grips on Cuba. They are also underhandedly or undermining things that are happening in Nicaragua. But this is not different than what we're seeing perpetrated in Honduras, Haiti, Puerto Rico. There is an overwhelming assault of the Americas that I think that people are seeing country by country and not a whole. Which I do think is significant, because all of these countries play a role in what we're seeing and what we're not seeing. For instance, where is Venezuela situated?
Resources.
Right. As a resource factor, but where's the situation situated in terms of how we even understand the Caribbean and Latin America, like in between Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, and what would that mean for the Caribbean and how the Caribbean responds to these particular assaults on Venezuela that will ultimately pull them into it, right? So then the question becomes, well, what does CARICOM have to say about this?
Well, before we get to that, and something just popped in my head that I want to be sure we get to, because when you get old like me, you forget things quickly. You mentioned security, and then in the same sentence, you mentioned hegemony. And that made me think about the difference between security / hegemony and safety. Because the United States loves, no matter what administration you're really focused on, they love to talk about security. And that, I think, lulls people into this false sense of safety. But the two are not necessarily synonymous.
Right.
And I use DC as an example. So Donald Trump can send 4,000 National Guard troops to the streets of DC, or send them into LA. Now he's talking about sending them into Chicago, talking about sending them into Baltimore, under the pretext of security. Well, that's really just a temporary cessation of violence. What makes those areas safe are jobs, education, healthcare, Social Security, the basic elements of life that make people secure, so that they then don't have to go out into the community and do the things that survival requires people to do. Does that make sense?
No, I agree. I think that's some of the things that I've been raising. Now, I've been speaking about what has been occurring in DC, since it's been occurring, because, we have organizations here locally in DC that are a part of the fight back, et cetera, and organizing people around this, but have continued to organize people around the occupation of DC, because security and crime, quote unquote, whether low or high, has always been the Trojan horse for occupation and militarization. So the way that crime is being used, if we go down the Beltway and we go to Baltimore, right? And the mayor's on a national tour about low crime. And essentially what we're saying is, when we praise the low crime statistics, right, is that, all of these initiatives that exist in Baltimore that are a product of over-policing, which is a 1033, Operation Relentless Pursuit, the Deadly Exchange Program. They work, right? Because they're keeping crime down. And then when we go down to DC, and the issue is, crime is out of control, which means we need to bring in the National Guard to support the MPD and embolden their actions, because they're completely out of control now. The way that it's being used is similar to what we're seeing with Venezuela, for instance, right? The reason why they're highlighting this narco trafficking is because crime in the Caribbean, quote unquote, is up. There's a wave of crime across the Caribbean, right? So Haiti obviously is being used specifically as this exceptional thing, right, with the crime and the gangs, but there's a crime wave across the Caribbean. Turks and Caicos had a no flight at some point in time. They were not allowing people to come and vacation in Turks and Caicos because crime went up. You see Jamaican policies and laws within that country has changed because crime went up. Earlier this year, before Trinidad and Tobago had this elections for their current prime minister, they signed a deal with Southcom because crime went up. So this is something that's occurring around the Caribbean. So then they can then use this to pinpoint and say, well, crime is going up because, Maduro and Venezuela are right here. And they have their, crime-ridden citizens and residents fleeing Venezuela and entering into our country. So this must be dealt with, right? So that is really, we're seeing how crime and this idea of security, because of the uptick in crime, these Caribbean nations have formed security alliances in tandem with the U.S., of course, to protect their nation, to deal with gangs and crimes, etc. So it's easy to then point to Venezuela and say, well, obviously, Venezuela is the problem here. So there's a support given to what's occurring.
So the question, or part of the question becomes, is the crime in question an inherent indigenous issue, or is the crime a response to existential outside external pressures? So the crime in Venezuela, well, if you take the sanctions off the country and you allow the country to engage equally in trade on the international markets, most likely, now I could be wrong here, but something tells me most likely the economy in the country would improve. and that people then would be able to if you take the sanctions off of Haiti and you allow the Haitian government to actually, if you allow, in fact, for there to be a government that can speak to the needs of the Haitian people, you probably won't have the problems I could go on country by country by country. But so what I'm seeing in Venezuela, what I'm seeing in Haiti, what I'm seeing in other areas is not inherent indigenous crime. These are the natural reactions to pressures that are put on countries and their governments from external forces.
Yes, and it's a way that these narratives create otherizations, right? Where it becomes, of course, Venezuelans are crime-ridden. Of course, Haitians are crime-ridden. Of course, residents in D.C. are crime-ridden, right? Because they have built up these particular narratives around these areas. And I also think it doesn't hurt that, as people in the U.S. are not familiar with anything that's happening in that region unless it becomes a headline, right? How many people could point to Trinidad and Tobago or Guyana? Or how many people understand that Guyana is next to Venezuela as part of South America, right? But it's
okay. Also... Well, let me jump in and add one more thing. So before I forget it, and that is we can also switch the conversation from crime to immigration.
Yes,
and you would be looking at similar causes. I don't hear, other than myself and you, I don't hear a whole lot of other people when it comes to the immigration conversation asking, why are the people coming here in the first place? Why are Mexicans coming across the US-Mexico border to come into the United States? Nobody wants to talk about the impact that NAFTA had on the Mexican economy, decimating the Mexican agricultural industry. Nobody talks about why, when J.D. Vance talked about those 30,000 Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating people's pets, nobody asked, well, why are there Haitians in Ohio in the first place?
Right. And I think that's where we get caught up in talking about crime specifically, right? Because then we get, whether it is happening or isn't happening, I don't think makes a difference, because none of this is because the U.S. has an interest in keeping these areas safe, right? These are unfounded claims, but they're not only just false, they're dangerous because they lay a groundwork for or to justify a military attack or potentially, a long phase lawfare campaign, right? Because we've seen these things play out before. So by linking Maduro specifically to transnational criminal organizations, they expand the justification for force, right? And then by the buy-in from surrounding countries that allows for the U.S. to continue to, usher in the drumbeats of war. So this attack on Venezuela, like I said earlier, just follows a trajectory of things that have been occurring. So this is not anything new specifically under the Trump administration, but It is something that is a continuance for how the U.S. really understands their ability to maintain control over a region. And that's the entire Americas. And so, for the Black Alliance for Peace, one of our campaign around the Zone of Peace, being a part of that and initiating that campaign in 2022 now, I believe, or at the top of 2023, and where we are now with the campaign and expanding it is to respond to this, because we see that there's a way that the U.S. and some of these neo-colonial-led CARICOM nations are bastardizing the concept of a zone of peace, as if to say that Venezuela is the obstruction to that actually happening in the Americas and not the U.S.
And let me just quickly, I had mentioned NAFTA, and for those who may not remember, that's the acronym for the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was brought into existence during the Clinton administration. And what it did, one of the things that it did, was it artificially depressed agricultural crop prices and to allow for American farm products to be to sell on the global market more advantageous to American farmers. And by artificially depressing the Mexican agricultural industry. It drove a lot of Mexican farmers out of business. It decimated the corn crop in Mexico to make U.S. corn more cheaper on the international market. And final point, as then Mexicans started importing American corn, that American yellow corn pollinated with the Mexican multicolored corn, which decimated and killed off the Mexican corn crop. So that's just one example. You can go to Guatemala, you can go to Honduras, you can go to all through Mexico and Central America, and you can look at the U.S. foreign policy in those countries, how the U.S. has controlled the governments in those countries over the years, to the advantage of American industry, to the disadvantage of the indigenous in those countries. Is that a fair, quick statement, Erica?
Yeah, well, I do think it's important to understand and gauge the global political economy and neoliberalism and how these play a factor into what we're seeing, right? Mm-hmm. Especially as we talk about the need for maintenance of control and the need for maintenance of hegemony. Obviously, when we talk about Venezuela, it is oil rich, but that entire region is oil rich, right? So what does it mean to then have the buy-in of these sort of neo-colonial ran governments that are not really speaking to what is happening, right? That are utilizing this aspects of crime so they themselves do not have to deal with their own internal issues that are a product of cutting and slashing Social Security for moving towards more privatization. We know that region has a history of unions and trade workers and et cetera, and how that has been chipped away year after year after year because of the particular governments. So again, there is a way that Venezuela gets to be named as the sole proprietor of all that is wrong in the Caribbean and around that general area because of these quote unquote gangs, right? Or crime or violence, or the need to protect, or the need to, the way, as they're saying now, the zone of peace, right? Which again is a bastardization of the commitment made in 2014 in Havana, Cuba, or the attempts thereafter, and the current attempts led by grassroots movements that Black Alliance of Peace is a part of.
So in response to this, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana support U.S. in moves against Venezuela. In a move that has clearly stunned her nation, Trinidad's government has thrown its full and unequivocal support behind planned and unanticipated U.S. military action against Venezuela, even offering Washington access to local soil if Venezuela ever attacks CARICOM. Well, have you heard Nicolas Maduro talk about attacking CARICOM? Erica, you're the expert. I'm not going to waste our time with me pontificating. Erica.
Well, again, security is that Trojan horse, right? But the core argument is that the recent military posture, at least what I'm trying to make, is that the recent military posture of the U.S. is not an isolated incident, right? Mm-hmm. It is the culmination of deliberate, decades-long strategy to dismantle this anti-imperialist foundation in the Caribbean. So it represents an extremely dangerous shift from regional sovereignty to neocolonial dependency. And this is driven, again, by external powers, primarily the U.S., and facilitated by local elites, and specifically Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. So they have completely abandoned their historical principles for short-term political and economic gain. And I say that as like the governance, right? Not so much the people. Because a statement that is released by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, her second time in office, similar to Trump, Kamala Prasad Bessassar, I want to say. The statement is that the U.S. government's deployment of American military assets into the Caribbean region to destroy the terrorist drug cartels has the full support of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Due to drug, human, and firearms trafficking, Caribbean countries, and in particular Trinidad and Tobago, have experienced massive spikes in transnational crime, gang activity, murders, violence, and financial crimes. So that is just the opening of the statement, right? So again, there's a way that they are using this as a way to not actually deal with the internal issues of their own country, but saying that this is something that is predicated by Venezuela. So they are in full support. So it's really not an exaggeration or an understatement to know how drastic of a change much of not just Trinidad and Tobago, but Guyana's posture is within Guyana's politics for Guyana's and Trinidad and Tobago's politicians to be openly advocating for Western intervention. Historically, if we talk about Guyana's political identity was forged through anti-colonial struggle. We talk about Walter Rodney often, but then also the history of the PPP, which stood firmly against Western intervention and interventionism, advocating for non-alignment and self-determination. And then so we see now the Guyanese government is openly advocating for Western military action, and primarily because of the prioritizing of external protection and capital, like its relationship with ExxonMobil currently, which puts the question of long-term interests over the people. But then much of this also is predicated on the land struggle between Guyana and Venezuela. My comrade Tamanisha Johns has written a really great piece on it. She's talking a lot about it as someone from Guyana. It's called Guyana and Venezuela, the currently unfolding crisis of imperialism. And I think that gives a good context to where we are with Guyana and why they would be supporting this. But again, this is not just a change in policy. It is a victory for this sort of neocolonial model over the historically liberationist one, right? And we can debate around whether or not this particular rose-colored glasses are around how we understand the radicalism of the Caribbean. But what is objective is that there is a history there that these current leaderships are undermining, because they're using the state, which was once a vehicle for emancipation, as an administrator for imperial interests. And so this shift is only possible with political actors who are willing to facilitate it, like the leadership in Trinidad and Tobago and the leadership in Guyana. And when I talk about Kamala, it is important when I name that this is the second time that Kamala's been here. Kamala has always maintained this sort of right-wing appeasal for the U.S. Kamala themselves are pretty conservative. There's so much Trump-like rhetoric on immigration, especially as it pertains to Venezuelans. She previously had anti-woke sentiments around Biden, all while she held no office. She was recognizing Juan Guaido, right? So we see that this is the sort of political environment that is ripe for aggressive or accepting this sort of aggressive militaristic solution to whatever the U.S. considers as a problem in the region. So just like Trump, we have Kamala that, that had these that's posturing, about crime, and he's very aggressive, kind of stand your ground-esque, similar themes in her speeches, especially post and capitalizing on these sort of post-election tensions that exist, because I don't want to say it's similar to, but there are dynamics of parties, political parties that exist in Trinidad and Tobago that she has been able to kind of capitalize on, because the previous political party, similar to the Democrats, did not do what they needed to do to maintain any kind of structural leadership. So folks are able to say, well, yeah, crime is a problem, similar to what we're dealing with here. If you want to make those kind of arguments around how we can maybe understand the development of why a Kamala would be in leadership and why a Trump would be in leadership. But neither the leaders in Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago are strong sovereignists, right? They're not really particularly fighting for that. Their power is increasingly dependent on aligning with these external agendas. And so it makes them willing partners, or it makes this a willing partnership with the militarization in the region. So they have nothing really to say, and they are welcoming it because, again, that they don't really have to speak to or about the actual issues that are causing what is occurring in their countries, like the economic exploitation, systemic poverty, the influx of illegal arms, because Trinidad and Tobago doesn't have an arms manufacturing, weapons building or site or anything, right? So where are these coming from, if not the U.S.? So I do see. I know that people do not, again, think about or really engage the Caribbean in terms of the politics that are happening in the Caribbean. But I do think, in addition to what we're seeing in Israel, this has really caused a lot of grassroots movements in the Caribbean to really think about the role that their own governments play in this sort of geopolitical frame. Because how can what does it mean that they have governments that are aligning with this military posture in Venezuela, who are also aligning with the military posture that's occurring in Israel, right? Yeah.
Haven't we seen this movie before? As we early in the 20th century, I want to say 1918, 1919, in Honduras. They were called the Banana Wars. The United States went in and overthrew the government of Honduras on behalf of the United Fruit Company.
Mm-hmm.
The Banana Wars. Now we have, I don't know, 5 months ago, Donald Trump says the oil off the coast of Venezuela should actually be the possession of the United States. And so so now what does Donald Trump do? He sends a flotilla of military naval vessels towards the region to intimidate the government of Venezuela. They've now raised the $25 million bounty that Joe Biden put on Maduro's head has now become $50 million. So I'm wondering, is ExxonMobil the new United Fruit Company?
That's an interesting take. Yeah, because this would be the first time I'm hearing it even put in that way, and so I do think that yes, historically there are ways that we see the same kind of playbook, because I do think that the U.S. does have a if it ain't broke kind of position, especially when we see this is not the first time they attacked Venezuela in this way. They're going to continue. I mean, even, I think Marco Rubio is saying that, they don't even recognize Venezuela. The U.S. does not recognize Maduro, right? So they've been saying this since 2016, 2017, 28, So they have been always posturing that they're not going to recognize Maduro. And that's, I think, that played into the Bolivar Act when Biden came into office. So, yes, there's a lot of rinse and repeat. When you mentioned the School of the Americas, which is now WINSEC, right? The Western Hemispheric Institute for Security, Economic Cooperation, or whatever, right? But it does the exact same thing. The exact same thing that it was always doing before in terms of amping up and propping up soft power. So I do think that it's important what you raise, because I do think none of this, if we're looking at Trinidad and Tobago, or we're looking at Guyana, or we're looking at countries in the Caribbean, whatever their domestic crises are, it cannot be understood in isolation any more than what's happening here could, right? It is all deeply entangled with the country's economic woes and neoliberal policies and the expanding militarized presence, right? Because this would not be the first time. The Caribbean engages in Operation Relentless Pursuit, which is a yearly military operation that includes NATO nations, right? Where they train them them. So when you hear about these security forces, early in the year, I wrote for Barr a piece called "Bound by Imperialism: Trinidad's Role in U.S. Agenda," because Trinidad put the nation under curfew. 48 hours. And much of this was with the support of Southcom and that military training that comes from it. So, these countries are positioning themselves as a lapdog to U.S. policies. They're sacrificing national sovereignty and undermining any pursuit to independent development strategies. And they are also joining in and threatening Venezuela by utilizing or bastardizing the zone of peace, right? You don't hear about the zone of peace as it pertains to Haiti. You don't hear Trinidad and Tobago's government or Guyana's government or Barbados' government. You don't hear them talking about the zone of peace as it pertains to Haiti. But they are, they are complicit in the narrative around Venezuela when they invoke the zone of peace to incite that Venezuela here might be in the wrong, or there's something happening in Venezuela that needs to be, dealt with. So the focus on Venezuela, like crime, is a distraction, because the real culprits here are the external forces that benefit from a divided and militarized and dependent region. And we're seeing that broken apart in that sort of lithium triangle currently, right? With Peru and Bolivia, and what's happening there. We see the way that the U.S. continues to create these sort of divisions so that they can occupy and maintain. So much of this, again, it marks a very dangerous departure from how we understood historically the use of the call for the Caribbean's zone of peace, or making the Caribbean a zone of peace, or the Americas a zone of peace. Again, trading in sovereignty and self-determination for dependency on these external powers, right? And perpetuating the very cycles of poverty and violence they claim to want to solve. Let me. I
don't even know if you can answer this question. I don't even know if and again, this might be a PhD dissertation, and we've only got 3 minutes or 4 minutes left. What is it? Is there something about the politics of Venezuela versus the politics of Trinidad and Tobago, where the Venezuelans rejected the imposition of Juan Guaido upon them by the United States? The Venezuelans rejected the imposition of Maria Machado by the United States on them, and they stuck with Maduro. Whereas the people in Trinidad, Kamala Persad Biesasar, they seem to accept her readily. So is there something about the dynamics of the politics that makes her acceptable in Trinidad and Tobago? Because if they tried they've tried and failed to do that in Venezuela. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, one, politically, the countries are different, right? Especially in terms of political parties that exist, and how they are supported by the masses, etc. I think we can make that kind of argument about, is it that the people of the U.S. overwhelmingly supports Trump, right? Or because in Trinidad there was a low voter turnout as well.
Okay.
Right. But I do think there was such discontent with the previous party because of the stripping away of safety nets, et cetera, et cetera. Raleigh did not even finish his term. There was an interim prime minister right before the elections. Raleigh bowed out to go spend off his days with his family. Right. So that is the previous party that's coming in. And again, I think she has capitalized off of that discontent, not dissimilar to Trump, right? Okay. So when you open this in terms of the statement that was made from the article or the piece, is that to Trinidad and Tobago's surprise. Again, this is not something Trinidad and Tobago is not openly interventionist. This is not, this is the land of carnival. They're not, openly advocating for military intervention. So to have someone who is in leadership doing that, this is a shock. Right. So I do want to highlight again that there are grassroots movements, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, like the Movement for Social Justice, that wrote a statement. They've written a statement in response to U.S. military circling and advancing on the Caribbean Sea, and then also response to COMLA that I do think speaks to this sort of already existing and growing anti-imperialist sentiment that's happening across the Caribbean, especially as a response to Israel.
Plus, Venezuela is the current Maduro government is an outgrowth of the Chavista revolution. Yes. He is an outgrowth of Hugo Chavez. And so when contrary to the dominant Western narrative, when the West talks about Maduro, they talk about Maduro more as a personality, as opposed to Nicolas Maduro is a continuation of a revolutionary movement. And I don't care how charismatic Maduro is or is not, if the Venezuelan people did not see him in the context of the Chavista movement, they'd have thrown his behind in the ocean a long time ago. So it has less to do with Maduro as a personality and more to do with Maduro as a continuation of the revolution. And the politics in Trinidad and Tobago don't reflect that similar sentiment.
No. Well, one, revolution, right?
Right. That's my point.
Right. So we could talk about the Black Power Revolution that happened in 1970s, but that is not in any way comparison, right? That is a student movement that, catapulted a particular kind of politic in Trinidad and Tobago, but that is not similar to the Chavista Revolution in that sense. But I do think, and I do want to close with saying this, especially as I talk about the zone of peace, because I do think that this speaks to the difference, right? Much of why we wanted to reinvigorate the concept of the zone of peace, especially as a call for people studying human rights, which is not what we're hearing from the Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago leadership, or even CARICOM's leadership, as they're speaking about zone of peace in response to aligning with the U.S. aggression against Venezuela, is that we're seeing what this call is the push and the prominence and advocacy for more grassroots voices, right? Because I do think there is a way that people think there is no opposition to these things happening, but there's no cohesive opposition to these things happening because everybody is doing their own thing in their own countries, right? So how do we begin to look at this as our Americas and look at the U.S. as the primary enemy of any kind of sovereignty across our Americas, whether here domestically or whether in the Caribbean or in Central and South America, right? So one of the calls in our demands when we launched the Zone of Peace campaign was to dismantle Southcom and shut down the 76 U.S. military bases and installations across the region. Currently on the web, on Black Alliance for Peace YouTube page, you can find the map of our Americas, which maps out the militarization. So you can see every military base in the U.S. and across the Americas and see how they're working in tandem. Because again, none of these things are isolated. We also call for the U.S. NATO militarization to be ended in our Americas. And one of the first steps in that was the U.S. NATO Out of Our Americas network, which includes the Caribbean Movement for Peace, and in conversation with the Movement for Social Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. It speaks to and emboldens, it has conversations directly with these organizations about how do we begin to get the masses of the people to understand the dilemmas and the dynamics of the current leadership and what they are walking the people into by aligning with the U.S. We also call to disband U.S.-sponsored state terrorist training facilities like WINSEC, which was formerly the School of the Americas, oppose the military intervention broadly, but also specifically in Haiti, and then also return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba and end imperialist sanctions and unilateral coercive measures like what is happening to Maduro in Venezuela. So we understand this as an aspect of our multi-phase collective campaign, establishing coordinated structure throughout the Americas about how we respond en masse to this, to obtain people-centered human rights or people-centered facilitation of the expulsion of U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination in the Americas. So I want to encourage folks to go to zoneofpeace.org. You can learn more information about the network. And then Haiti Americas we've also on the Black Alliance for Peace page on Movement News, we have the Movement for Social Justice statement. We also have our statement on Venezuela. I do encourage folks to engage what is happening in the Caribbean and how, the fight back that's occurring.
Erica Caines, as always, thank you for fitting us into your schedule today. Your analysis is always on point and greatly, and look forward to having you back.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, folks, thank you all so much for joining us today. And those of you that joined early, thank you. We taped this early. It's going to replay in its regular slot, regular time. Greatly appreciate you all joining us early as you did. Thank you for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Brother Tom Porter is going to join us. And here's the question we're going to be talking about tomorrow. What in the world does the bifurcation or the splitting up of any African country do for Africans? How can that benefit Africans? We're going to talk about that tomorrow. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Those of you that are new, and we saw a number of additional likes today, please, again, click that like button. Subscribe. We're closing on 10,000, and we need you all to help us get there. Follow us on social media. All the links are below. Remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Why? Because it's rhetoric free. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.